Okay, so what is it about?
Well, the electric telegraph had been used for about 10 years prior to the war to control train traffic on the railroads, and so the telegraph network was pretty extensive by 1861 when the war started. And so, of course, a lot of messages by then were being transmitted by telegraph. In fact, in 1861, the first transcontinental line replaced the Pony Express in the fall of '61. And so there was a lot of progress and developments in telegraphy by then. And so President Lincoln's administration, Secretary of War Stanton, really recognized this, and he decided to tap his resources, friends and so forth at the Pennsylvania Railroad, to principally the Pennsylvania Railroad, to provide telegraphers to the government. And they formed the United States Military Telegraph, sometimes called Corps, but sometimes they put Corps on the end, sometimes they didn't. But anyway, the USMT was the primary electric telegraph group on the Union side. The Signal Corps did some electromagnetic telegraphy for a while, but they were, by '63, they were phased out of it, and the USMT did all the electric telegraph. Then they developed this wagon system about in '62, '63, whereby they had everything fixed in the wagon, and they had Danielle cells. These are Danielle cells here, 6 in this box, which comprised of a copper cylinder, zinc rod, and a porous clay cup separating the copper and zinc. Then there was 2 electrolytes involved. There was copper sulfate, which is what this blue crystal is, also called blue vitriol or bluestone, and that was mixed with water in the cells around the copper, and then you did the same thing with zinc sulfate about the zinc, and either they put zinc sulfate or sulfuric acid around the zinc, and then that would eventually create zinc sulfate. So there were 80 to 100 of those cells perhaps in these wagons, and then that applied a electric potential of around 100 to 150 volts at one end of the line. These wagons were put at the end of a temporary line, typically a temporary line. Perhaps they would have been used where a railroad station was destroyed along a permanent wire, but these wagons could be placed closer to command positions that were closer to the battlefields, and allow the commanders to have instantaneous communication over a long distance. The Signal Corps was operating in the same time period with aerial signals, using flags during the day and flares at night, and they were effective at communicating from high points, usually up in the trees, mountaintops, or they built towers as well. But they used a different code to signal with. But anyway, the Morse telegraph was developed by Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail in the 1836 to 1840 time period, and they came up with the key to transmit with, which is a switch. Essentially, it's a two-part switch, and I'm just going to do something here for a moment here.
And don't forget you have to clap in between.
So the key was a two-part switch. It had a lever on the side to open and close the circuit, and then it had the main part here to press up and down on. And so when you were not sending, you kept the circuit closed, and so you closed the lever on the side, and current was flowing all the time through your relay when you were not sending. And then when you wanted to send, you open the lever on the side, and then you would send with this part of it here. When you closed the circuit, current flowed through the key and the relay, which are electromagnets, and then they were connected in series to every other office on the line. so every office on the line heard the same thing, and each office was defined by a call sign, so a 2-letter call sign. So if you wanted to reach a certain location, you had to know their office call sign. Off of the relay were contacts that were like a switch that closed the circuit in a local circuit to the sounder, and the sounder made it easier to hear the Morse code. You had to hear both when it went down, which was more punctuated, as well as when it released. And so you had to know the difference between those two sounds, because that defined whether it was short, commonly called a dot, or long, a dash. And so, you know, an A is a dot dash. So you had to hear that and know whether it was short or long. The sounder was an electromagnet as well. That's all everything was back then, was electromagnetic action, where when a current flowed, it attracted an iron or an iron-based armature over, and that made a clicking noise. Yeah. So that's pretty much what the Morse code amounted to. Of course, a lot of things were developed around it. The ciphers were used to make it harder for the enemy to understand the message. The U.S. military telegraph had cipher books that were like this, where times of day and people and geographical positions were defined by arbitrary words, and they'd have indexes like this where 2 different words could be used to describe a certain officer or location. And then they also had a first word would define a matrix that would define, you'd reorder the sentence, the words in the sentence, based on the matrix. And then, so you jumble the words, and then you would substitute words for those keywords. Between doing those 2 things, it was really hard for the enemy to, even if they understood the Morse code, which both sides used the same Morse code, but even if they understood it, they had a hard time really understanding the whole message. So that's principally what was used on the Union side.
Yeah. Didn't the Union use Morse code a lot more than others?
The Union used telegraphy more overall, simply because there was a lot more railroads in the north and in the territory that the Union eventually controlled. And wherever the railroads were, that's where the telegraph was.
Yeah, I remember seeing something in a program that I saw that Grant started to hate the telegraph because Lincoln would send him daily messages of where he wanted him to go.
Yeah, the telegraph was, I'm sure depending on one's perspective, it was good and bad, especially on the Union side for command, because the War Department in Washington had a well-defined, elaborate, maybe for that time, telegraph office, and Lincoln would reportedly spend a lot of time there, and he'd read the telegrams that were for whoever his staff was or whoever. There was no filtering of the message, and so he got things firsthand, and then he could respond to them firsthand, and I'm sure it probably was frustrating to a lot of